Okay, so we pick it up on Poetic Phenomenological Meditation 471702, originally written in February the 17th, 2004. I'm in the middle at that time, in the beginning rather, of taking up the first sort of major category, which is evocative speech. And I claimed on a couple meditations ago in 47011502 that an exemplary of evocative speech was Heidegger's question, how is it with the nothing? And I would say that if you were to ask me, well, what is the philosophical question that you would say is generating, because philosophy, let me step aside for a second, why put it in those terms? Philosophy is um, motivated or propelled by the force of inquiry. So for every philosophical project, I would argue, and I would contend, it would be my thesis, that there is one sort of fundamental question, right? That there's like one question that's sort of driving the particular treatise or essay or question, project, thesis, what have you, book. So insofar as a project is bound, and this project is bound by this year-long experiment, and then ultimately is published as the book Being and Learning, and the boundaries of that project are that, and they're motivated and propelled by the question. I would argue, how is it with the nothing? Now, in the paper, the preliminary paper that got everything going, tune in, turn on, let learning happen. The question that motivated that was, well, what is it that turns us around to being? And when I use the term turning, or when I say turning, as I'm reading these meditations, and in the meditations themselves, obviously, when I use the term turning, I'm always referring to this particular turning towards being, right? And so that's the phenomenology of learning is based on that attention that we have towards being's excess. And so the question that's motivating the project in one sense is, how do we turn ourselves around, or how do we get turned around to the attentiveness or attunement towards being's excess, right? The excess being that which gives us something to think about, and in terms of thinking, that which gives meaning to our lives, we could say. So, but within that larger question, I would say the thing that's really motivating, the thing that's really getting the project underway, really propels the force of it, at least early on in the project, and it may be the question that gets the thinking going in response to the bigger question, if you will, is the question, how is it with the nothing? So in 2 days ago, I concluded the meditation with that question, and then yesterday I got into how this question becomes what I call a directive, and we sort of started to talk a little bit about Socrates and how he was directed towards this excessive quality of being, and I called the directive the decisive directive that catches and throws us into learning. And so, continuing on to today's meditation, phenomenological meditation, 47011702. So when I refer to the question at the beginning of this meditation, I'm referring to the question, how is it with the nothing? So when I say Heidegger's question, that's what I'm referring to. Heidegger raises this question in a tactical move that exemplifies the kind of evocative speech that invokes what we have been calling the turning. We are interested in understanding what is involved in learning, and have proceeded by focusing on how the desire for learning is activated and maintained by evocative speech. Our aim here is not, unlike Heidegger and others who have identified language, specifically communication, that is, symbolic interaction, as the phenomena to be addressed in the reposing or repositioning, in terms of our relation with it, of a phenomena that has become stale, worn, devoid of novelty, spontaneity, and possibility. When matters have become settled, questioning is demanded. Questioning draws our attention to and seeks to open up the meaning of the terms we use in naming our world and experiencing it together. Questioning enables our relation with the phenomena to be relocated or repositioned. Questioning as questioning proceeds from and supports an attitude of openness. When we pose the question, we have already been opened by that which has addressed us, has stood out, and drawn our attention. That which draws our attention has turned us. The question is both what draws our attention and our response when we are addressed. Questioning is thus a mode of being. For Heidegger, the question, how is it with the nothing, takes us directly to being. That is, to the question concerning our relation to being. How is it with the nothing is thus a reposing of the question of being. Specifically, the question enables him to draw a distinction between philosophy and thinking, and thereby to forward his agenda to overcome the former, if the former philosophy is identified with the tradition of metaphysics, which was fixated on mapping being in terms of the domain of beings. Metaphysics offers a static formulation of being, reducing it to the manifestation of what is. As such, metaphysics represents the same logic that dominates the contemporary discourses on education. As we discussed above, the error in philosophy has been twofold. First, to render truth as a permanent, eternal, and thereby static phenomena that is located in a trans-historical sphere. Second, philosophy identified in humans a faculty or capacity which was likewise unchanging and essential, that enabled the human being to acquire knowledge of a truth. The important emphasis must be placed on the traditional way in which knowledge denoted a kind of possession. Thus, to know was to obtain, acquire, appropriate, or to have. The knower within this schema stands outside the domain of inquiry, or the field of knowledgeable, or what is potentially known. As we have seen, however, learning can be differently understood as a way of being in the world. In this sense, it becomes a matter of comportment, which identifies learning as a certain kind of relation one maintains that is more passive than active, if by the latter we mean the activity of acquisition, appropriation, taking in, and acquiring. Learning as comportment is a passive modality, not an unchanging substance. But it is only passive to the extent that we understand the implication of a questioning that seizes us. When we have understood that we are able to be opened up by a form of communicating that directs us because it evokes in us a sense of wonder. Questioning evokes wonder. We are seized by wonder. When we are seized by wonder, the question has addressed us in our openness. When we have been addressed in our openness, we have been enjoined to being as a process and as that which is beyond beings. The question, how is it with the nothing, is an attempt to evoke wonder about the fact that there is something rather than nothing, and simultaneously that there will be and there is not yet. Heidegger's emphasis on the historicity or temporality of human experience attempts to offer a new ontology or doctrine of being, one that is capable of expressing being as a processual unfolding. The new task of philosophy, if it is to overcome its tradition, metaphysics, is to think this process. But thinking here must be understood, not be understood in cognitive terms, but rather as a matter of comportment, as an existential posture, as a way of being in the world. We have called the comportment that is placed or directed towards being attunement, Posing the question, how is it with the nothing, is an example of this attempt to draw our attention towards being as a process of unfolding. But how does this question, as an expression of evocative speech, seek to seize us with wonder? What does this question intend or attempt to say? Why is it evocative? Why does it enjoin us in poetic dialogue, that is, compel us to respond with inquiry, with questions? Why does this question address us in our openness, which is another way of asking how this question enjoins us with being as a process? So that's how I concluded that 471702. It's interesting as I'm reading this meditation, and I'm just looking at my timer here, and I'm liking that I'm only at 11 minutes because I guess my goal is to get it under 15 minutes. Why? Because I want people to be able to watch these videos and not feel that. Well, I feel 20 minutes or less is a kind of, it's enough to ask people. Maybe that's just what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling. All right, so in this particular meditation, as I was reading it, I thought to myself that I could feel, or I was brought back to this these early moments, these early days of this experiment, and I can feel myself, or remember feeling at the time as I was writing, how far I was going to allow myself. The feeling I was having was a feeling of wonderment, and it was a question: how far am I going to let myself go with this writing? In terms of how, I suppose, how far am I going to let myself get into this question of being, and how far am I going to allow myself to go in terms of this question of how is it with the nothing? And by that, I mean, how far am I willing to go with the language I'm using, the way I'm phrasing things, and I guess more importantly, how far am I going to let myself go in terms of this somewhat unpredictable process that I'd found myself in, right? So as one is writing and one is sort of a lot, so the move here with the poetic phenomenological meditation is that one is documenting the very phenomena that one is addressing, or that's being addressed to one. So in the case of talking about being's excess, and in this particular meditation, making this distinction between being as a static, eternal phenomena, something like Plato's forms, which is the sort of, or sort of traditional standard for our understanding of metaphysics. And it goes back to Parmenides' distinction between the world of being and the world of becoming. Right? So what I've said from the beginning, and I articulated this already in the preliminary paper, is that my move is to sort of overturn that distinction in terms of it being a hierarchy, and sort of acknowledge the possibility of these two worlds coexisting, and that for me, what's interesting then is this the world of becoming, and this is the world that we find ourselves in. And rather than trying to escape or transcend this world, to place oneself within this world in the most intense way possible. And in that way, I want to argue one has come closely related to being, right? So if the old tradition or the classic tradition is one of transcendence, transcending to this realm of being and sort of beholding being in its eternal glory, and this is taken over by medieval philosophy and theology, and there's a whole mystical tradition of this. Here I'm making the move, and this is what I say in the preliminary paper, to being as presencing, or being as becoming. So if the phenomenological work here is one of attending to that, then as a thinker, how does this appear to us, right? So the poetic phenomenological meditation is an attempt to sort of capture this process as I experienced it. So the question that was posing itself, and as I'm reading this, I remember this and early on, was how far am I going to go with this, or how far am I going to be taken away, I think would be the more appropriate way of putting it. And how much am I going to allow myself, or how far am I going to allow myself to be taken away? Right. So if one is going to do this if one is going to be seriously committed to it, then you have to just sort of let yourself go. And in the scheme of things, that's not unreasonable, because it's rather, sort of confined, right, in the space of time. That is to say, 1 hour, 1.5 hours a day of writing, and one can allow oneself to be taken away. So that's on the one hand, I'm feeling this, and at a certain point already, I recall in reading these, I sort of went for the, well, we'll just see where it goes. And part of the experiment was to not be concerned about making an argument or having I wasn't working with an outline, obviously, so just let yourself go. So, in this particular meditation, I thought it was interesting to see this distinction, and I really I'm sort of leaning on Heidegger to help me make this move towards the being as a process, right? Attunement towards being as a process, and learning as a comportment of passivity, and making this distinction between allowing oneself and being open and allowing oneself to be moved by inquiry, rather than to be seeking something to acquire or to possess. Right, and the important underlining of questioning, right, and inquiry, which I talked about before I read the meditation, I think is important. The other thing I would just want to note here is that here I talk about the new task of philosophy is to think the process. To me, I think that's the key line of this meditation. At one point, I thought that maybe what I should do is go back and just pull out key lines of every meditation. So maybe here on day 3, day 4 actually, I'll start that, so that I'll sort of identify what I think is like the key sentence. And to me, the key sentence from this meditation is, the new task of philosophy, if it is to overcome its tradition, metaphysics, is to think this process. And the process, of course, is being as a processual unfolding. So that's the key there. The last point I want to make is that I noticed that what I recall, and again, this is going back fresh eyes. I didn't reread the whole thing, and I certainly don't even reread it before I sit down to read it as a film, or record the reading of it. I just sit down and pick it up and read it fresh. And I'm noticing here that something that happened was that I, at this point already on day 4, started concluding the meditations with questions. And I remember that the point there is that each meditation should end with a series of questions, so that in the example of, I think it's India, a certain tradition of Indian drumming. I remember hearing this from this girl that I met when we were traveling back on the bus from Pennsylvania, and that's a whole other story, but I was coming back from Pennsylvania when I was in graduate school, the new school, and I met this student, a fellow grad student, and she was in all sorts of things, but among things, we had a common interest in Hegel, so we talked a lot about Hegel, and she also was interested in drumming, and I obviously was interested in drumming too. And then she was telling me that she'd been in India and studied drumming for a bit, and then we were talking about that, and she said the interesting thing that she'd learned was that in a certain tradition, and I don't recall, of Indian drumming, whereas we're used to the sort of dramatic conclusion of a final note or dramatic conclusion where you end on the downbeat, she said that in this tradition, the last motion, the last beat is actually open, so that rather than concluding with the hand on the drum, the conclusion of the performance is always the hand off of the drum. So that's the actual conclusion. And in analogous form, by concluding the meditation with questions, what I was motivated by was this idea of, the hand being away from the drum as the piece concludes. And so the questions are anticipating the next meditation. And I think that I sort of discovered that formula, um, you know, already on day 2, I think it was, but I'm sort of calling attention to this now because it really has become clear to me how important that was to end with questions that would then sort of give me something the next day to pick up on. And that seems like a reasonable formula, and I think that that works. And to this day, when I teach, I tell my students that when they write these short pieces that are equivalent of the meditations, that is to say, about 700 words or 500 words, or whatever the case may be, I always say, whatever your writing is, I want you to end with a set of questions. And so there you have it. So we'll pick it up again tomorrow with these questions on the evocative speaking, or and particularly the question, how is it with the nothing?